I don't really know how to start this, but I guess the best way is just to say it plainly. My parents never really wanted me. At least that's how it always felt growing up. I'm the younger child. My brother, Daniel, is 3 years older than me, and from the moment we were born the difference between how we were treated was obvious. It wasn't something dramatic at first. No screaming, no cruelty you could easily point at. It was quieter than that, the kind of thing that slowly shapes your entire childhood. According to my grandma, when my mom was pregnant the second time, my parents were convinced they were having another boy. My dad apparently told everyone that 2 sons would be perfect. When I was born and the doctor said it's a girl, the room went awkwardly quiet. My grandma told me once, years later, that my dad forced a smile and said, "Well, I guess that's fine too." That sentence kind of sums up my entire childhood. Daniel was the future. I was the extra. My parents talked about him like he was some kind of investment. From the time he was a kid, they were convinced he would do something huge. My dad used to say things like, "Daniel is going to make this family proud one day." They would brag about him constantly, even for small things. He got average grades? He's just bored because he's too smart. He skipped homework? Creative minds don't like rules. Meanwhile, if I brought home straight A's, the reaction was usually something like, "Well, studying is what girls are supposed to do." I remember one specific moment when I was about 8 years old. Daniel had gotten an AC on a math test, and my parents sat him down at the kitchen table and spent an hour comforting him, telling him he was still brilliant and that the teacher probably graded too harshly. The same week, I got the highest score in my class. My mom looked at the paper, nodded once, and said, "Good. Now go help set the table." That was it. No hug. No, "We're proud of you." Nothing. The only person who ever seemed genuinely happy for me was my grandma. She used to keep my report cards in a little folder like they were something valuable. At the time I didn't fully understand what was happening. I just thought maybe I had to try harder. Kids are really good at blaming themselves. Looking back now, though, it's pretty clear that in my parents' eyes, I was never meant to be the main character in the family. I was just the backup plan. As I got older, the differences between how my parents treated Daniel and me became impossible to ignore. At first it was small comments. The kind adults make that they think kids won't remember. But kids remember everything. Every dinner seemed to turn into a comparison. Not always directly, but enough that the message was clear. If Daniel did something wrong, my parents would somehow spin it into something positive. "He just has a strong personality." If I made even a small mistake, it became proof that I wasn't good enough. "Why can't you be more confident like your brother?" That sentence followed me for years. It didn't matter what the situation was. If Daniel talked loudly at family gatherings, he was charismatic. If I spoke too quietly, I was awkward. If he ignored chores, it was because he was focused on bigger goals. If I forgot one thing, I was irresponsible. The comparisons became constant once we were both in school. Daniel struggled with classes. A lot. But my parents treated it like a temporary inconvenience. They were convinced he was some kind of misunderstood genius who would eventually explode with success. Meanwhile, I studied constantly. Not because anyone asked me to, but because it was the only way I knew how to earn some kind of approval. Straight A's. Perfect attendance. Extra projects. It never seemed to matter. Instead, my grades became another comparison. One night during dinner, my dad looked at my report card and said something that stuck with me for years. "Well, of course she gets good grades. She doesn't have Daniel's potential." I remember sitting there quietly while they talked about my brother's future like it was already guaranteed. Startup ideas. Big careers. Money. Then my mom looked at me and added casually, "She'll probably just find a normal job and settle down. Not everyone needs to be exceptional." I was 14. And somehow my entire life had already been decided for me. After that, I stopped telling them about my achievements. There didn't seem to be a point. The only person who still cared was my grandma. Every time she visited, she would ask me about school, actually listen, and tell me she was proud of me. Sometimes she'd even argue with my parents about how differently they treated us. They always brushed it off. "Don't exaggerate," my mom would say. But the truth was simple. In my parents' minds, Daniel was the future. And I was just there. By the time I finished high school, I had already accepted something that most kids probably shouldn't have to accept that early. I wasn't going to get support from my parents. Not emotional support. Not encouragement. Definitely not financial support. All of that was reserved for Daniel. My parents constantly talked about how expensive his future was going to be. Special courses, business programs, connections, opportunities. They treated every dollar spent on him like it was an investment that would eventually pay off. When it came to me, the conversation was always different. Whenever I mentioned university, my mom would shrug and say things like, "Well, you can probably go somewhere local." My dad once said, "There's no reason to spend big money on a degree you won't even use." It was pretty clear they weren't planning to help me. But there was one person who refused to let that happen. My grandma. She had been quietly watching everything for years. The comparisons. The favoritism. The way my parents talked about Daniel like he was destined for greatness and about me like I was just filling space. One evening during my final year of school, she came to visit and asked me about my university applications. I remember hesitating before answering because I didn't want to sound unrealistic. But I told her the truth. I had applied to a prestigious university in another city. A really good one. The kind that could actually open doors for a career. I just didn't expect to get in. And even if I did, I had no idea how I would afford it. My parents overheard the conversation and immediately laughed it off. My dad literally said, "Why would she go there? That's for students who actually plan to do something big." My mom added, "Besides, we're already helping Daniel figure out his path." I still remember the silence that followed. Then my grandma calmly put her hand on the table and said something that changed my life. "If she gets accepted," she said, "I'll pay for it." The entire room went quiet. My parents tried to argue with her. They said it was a waste of money. That it wasn't necessary. That I should just stay close to home. But my grandma didn't budge. A few months later, I got the acceptance letter. And thanks to the only person who ever truly believed in me, I packed my bags and left. For the first time in my life, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could build a future that belonged to me. Moving away for university felt like stepping into a completely different life. For the first time, I wasn't living in a house where everything I did was quietly compared to someone else. No one knew my brother. No one knew the family dynamic I had grown up with. I was just another student. And honestly, that freedom was terrifying at first. For years I had been taught, directly or indirectly, that I wasn't exceptional, that I would probably just end up living an average life. So when I arrived at this prestigious university my grandma had paid for, I kept expecting someone to eventually realize I didn't belong there. But that moment never came. Instead, something strange happened. I started doing well. Really well. My professors actually listened when I spoke in class. Some of them even encouraged me to participate more. I joined study groups, and for the first time people treated my opinions like they mattered. It took a while to get used to that. My classmates weren't comparing me to anyone. They weren't measuring me against some imaginary, more talented sibling. They only saw the work I was doing. And apparently, it was good. By my second year, I was consistently near the top of my classes. I received a few academic awards and even got the chance to assist one of my professors on a research project. Every time something good happened, I called my grandma. She would always react the same way, like it was the most exciting news in the world. "I knew it," she would say proudly. "You were always capable of great things." My parents, on the other hand, barely seemed interested. Whenever I visited home during holidays, the conversations were always about Daniel. What he was planning. What business idea he was exploring. How he just needed the right opportunity. Sometimes my mom would ask me how university was going, but it felt more like small talk than genuine interest. One time I mentioned that I had received a scholarship for academic performance. My dad nodded and said, "That's nice." Then he immediately turned back to Daniel and asked about some startup idea he had been talking about for weeks. That moment should have hurt. But strangely, it didn't. Because by then, I had started to realize something important. The world outside my parents' house didn't see me the way they did. And in that world, I was finally starting to succeed. By the time I graduated, things were already looking better than I ever expected. Not just good considering my childhood, but genuinely good. During my final year at university, one of my professors recommended me for an internship at a well-known company in my field. It was competitive, and I almost didn't apply because I assumed someone more confident or more impressive would get it. But my professor practically forced me to send the application. A few weeks later, I got the offer. I still remember staring at the email for a full minute because I thought there had to be some mistake. That internship eventually turned into my first real job. And surprisingly, I loved it. The company had a really supportive environment. My coworkers were friendly, helpful, and actually enjoyed working together. My manager was one of those rare bosses who cared about developing people instead of just squeezing work out of them. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was surrounded by people who believed I had potential. And slowly, my confidence started to grow. Projects I worked on started getting noticed. My manager began trusting me with more responsibility. Within a year, I was already handling tasks that normally went to employees who had been there much longer. Every small success felt unreal. Sometimes I would sit at my desk and think about that 14-year-old girl who had been told she would probably just live an ordinary life. If only she could see this. Meanwhile, Daniel's life seemed to move in the opposite direction. I didn't know all the details, but from what I heard during occasional calls with my parents, he had jumped between several business ideas that never really worked out. Each one seemed to start with a lot of excitement and end with excuses about bad timing or the wrong partners. But my parents still believed in him completely. "He just hasn't found the right opportunity yet," my mom would say. I didn't argue. At that point, I had learned something important: nothing I said would ever change the way they saw him. So instead, I focused on my own life. Work was going well. I had good friends. My career was steadily moving forward. And for the first time since childhood, I felt stable. I had no idea that this stability was about to become the very thing that would cause the biggest problem in my life. After a few years at my job, something happened that I never thought would be possible for someone like me. I started saving real money. Not huge amounts at first, but enough that my bank account slowly began to grow. My salary had increased after a promotion, and I had always been careful with spending. Growing up the way I did kind of forces you to learn how to be independent early. Still, owning a house always felt like something other people did. People with supportive families. People whose parents helped them financially. Not someone like me. But one evening, while I was looking through my finances, I realized something surprising. I had enough saved for a down payment. The idea felt almost ridiculous at first. I kept thinking there had to be something I was overlooking. But after talking to a financial advisor and looking at several options, it became clear that it was actually possible. So I started visiting houses. The process was stressful, confusing, and exciting all at the same time. I looked at dozens of places before I finally found one that felt right. It wasn't some huge luxury property, but it was beautiful to me. A small, modern house in a quiet neighborhood. The moment I walked through the front door, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. A few months later, after mountains of paperwork and more stress than I want to remember, the deal was finalized. I had my own home. The first person I called was my grandma. She cried on the phone when I told her. "I knew you'd build something wonderful for yourself," she said. When I told my parents, the reaction was very different. My mom sounded surprised, but not in a happy way. "You bought a house? Already?" My dad asked how much it cost and then made a comment about how risky it was to take on such a big responsibility. There was no "we're proud of you." But by then, I didn't really expect it. What I didn't know at the time was that this house, the one thing I had built entirely on my own, would soon become the center of a conflict I never saw coming. Because around the same time my life was finally stable, my brother's life completely collapsed. Around the same time I bought my house, something started changing in my parents' phone calls. For years they had talked about Daniel like he was always one step away from success. There was always some new idea, some big opportunity just around the corner. But suddenly, the tone shifted. At first it was subtle. My mom would sigh more often when she mentioned him. My dad sounded irritated in ways I hadn't heard before. They stopped talking about exciting plans and started talking about setbacks. Eventually, the full story came out. Daniel's latest business idea had completely failed. And apparently, it wasn't a small failure. From what I managed to piece together, he had borrowed money from several people, including our parents, to start some kind of online company. He had promised big returns, talked about rapid growth, the usual stuff. But the company never really took off. The money disappeared quickly. The business collapsed. And Daniel was left with nothing. No savings. No stable job. No real plan. So he did the only thing he seemed to know how to do. He moved back in with our parents. Suddenly the same parents who had spent years saying he was destined for greatness were now financially supporting a grown man in his 30s who had completely crashed. But what surprised me the most was that they still defended him. "He just had bad luck," my mom said during one call. "Successful people fail many times before they win," my dad added. Meanwhile, Daniel apparently spent most of his time at home trying to figure out his next move. I didn't think too much about it at the time. People go through difficult periods, and despite everything, he was still my brother. I honestly hoped he would figure things out. What I didn't realize was that while his life was falling apart, he had started paying very close attention to mine. And seeing my success was about to make him very angry. At first, I didn't even realize anything was wrong. Work was going well like usual. My projects were moving forward, my manager seemed satisfied with my performance, and my life in general felt stable. Then small, strange things started happening. A coworker who had always been friendly suddenly became distant. Another colleague asked me a weird question about whether I was planning to leave the company soon. My manager scheduled an unexpected meeting with me and asked if everything was okay outside of work. It all felt off. A few days later, I finally found out why. Someone had been spreading rumors about me. Serious ones. Apparently, people had been told that I had lied on my resume, that my university achievements were exaggerated, and that I had somehow manipulated my way into promotions at the company. When my manager told me this, I felt like the ground disappeared under my feet. None of it was true. Not even close. But the worst part about rumors is that once they start spreading, they create doubt, even if people don't fully believe them. For a moment, I genuinely thought I might lose everything I had worked for. My job. My reputation. Maybe even my house if my career collapsed. The stress during those weeks was unbearable. I barely slept. Every day I walked into the office wondering if it might be my last. Eventually the company's HR department got involved, because the rumors had become serious enough to require an internal investigation. And that's when the situation took an even more disturbing turn. Because when they started tracing where the rumors originally came from, One name kept appearing again and again. Daniel. My brother had been contacting people connected to my company, sometimes pretending to be someone else, and telling them stories about how I had lied my way into success. Apparently, seeing me succeed while his life had fallen apart was something he couldn't accept. So he decided to try and destroy my life instead. When HR told me that my brother was likely the source of the rumors, I honestly didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to believe there had to be some misunderstanding. Maybe someone misinterpreted something he said. Maybe he was venting to the wrong person and things spiraled out of control. But the evidence kept piling up. Emails. Fake accounts. Messages sent to people connected to my company. All of it traced back to him. I remember sitting in the HR office feeling completely numb while they explained what they had discovered. My manager looked almost as shocked as I was. The rumors hadn't just appeared randomly. Someone had actively tried to sabotage me. For a few days I felt completely overwhelmed. Years of work suddenly felt fragile, like everything I had built could collapse because of someone else's bitterness. But something in me finally snapped. For most of my life, I had been the quiet one in the family. The one who tried not to cause problems. The one who just worked harder instead of arguing. This time I wasn't going to stay quiet. I gathered everything. My academic records. Official documents from the university. Letters from professors. Performance reviews from my company. Every single thing that proved the rumors were lies. HR conducted a full internal review, and my manager personally backed me up. The process took weeks, but eventually the conclusion became clear to everyone involved. The accusations were completely false. Not only that, but the company confirmed that someone had deliberately attempted to damage my professional reputation. When the investigation ended, my manager called me into his office. I was honestly preparing myself for bad news. Instead, he looked at me and said something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. "We're not losing you over someone else's jealousy." The company officially cleared my name. My job was safe. My reputation was intact. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I could breathe again. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the drama. Because when my parents found out what had happened, they didn't react the way I expected at all. A few weeks after the dust settled at work, I got a call from my mom. Her voice had that familiar mix of insistence and disappointment. "You need to help Daniel," she said. Plain and simple. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. What do you mean?" I asked. "He's struggling. He has no job, no money. You need to support him," she added, like it was a perfectly reasonable request. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't a casual suggestion. It was an expectation. "You mean, financially?" I asked slowly, trying to mask my disbelief. "Yes. You've been successful. You can afford it. He's your brother, and it's your responsibility," she said, as if handing me a verdict. My dad chimed in next, sounding almost rehearsed. "You know, we raised him to be great. But sometimes people need help, and since you've done well, it's only fair you step up." I was silent. I had worked so hard, fought so many battles to reach this point, and now they were asking me to fix a situation they had created, one they had coddled and favored my brother through, all while sidelining me my whole life. It wasn't just unfair. It felt insulting. I tried reasoning calmly. "I'm sorry, but I can't. I worked for everything I have. I'm not responsible for his failures." My mom's voice sharpened. "Ungrateful. That's what you are. After everything we did for you." I interrupted. "What exactly did you do for me?" Silence. I knew the answer already. And deep down, I knew I wasn't wrong to feel angry. It wasn't over yet, but this confrontation was just the beginning of me standing up for myself. The next person who stepped in would completely change the dynamic. Just when I thought my parents' demands might crush me, my phone rang. It was my grandma. She had always been the one person who truly saw me, the only one who treated me like my accomplishments mattered, who celebrated me instead of comparing me to Daniel. "Don't argue with them alone," she said firmly. Her voice had that calm authority she always had when she was about to school someone. I explained everything: their demand for money, the ungrateful accusations, and their insistence that I support my brother financially despite everything. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Zoe, you need to understand something. They gave you nothing. Nothing at all. Everything they did for you was for show or because it suited them. You owe them nothing." I felt a mix of relief and disbelief. After decades of feeling like I had to prove myself, someone was telling me I didn't have to bend to their will. "They think they're entitled to your money because you finally succeeded. But success doesn't make you their property," she continued. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a real ally, not just a supporter, but someone willing to confront my parents with the truth. When I next spoke to them, she was there. She calmly but firmly told them exactly what I had told her. "You gave her nothing but comparison and neglect. You cannot demand gratitude or payment for your failures to support your son." There was tension on the line. My parents sputtered, tried to justify themselves, but my grandma didn't budge. For the first time, I wasn't the only one standing up. And in that moment, I realized something important: I wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. It was the first step toward finally being recognized for who I really was, not Daniel's sister, not the backup child, but me. After my grandma stepped in, something finally changed in the family dynamics. My parents stopped calling me every other day demanding money for Daniel. They still occasionally made comments about how I should help more, but with my grandma present, those words had no bite. It was strange, realizing that their power over me had been largely psychological all these years. They had counted on my compliance, my desire for approval, my need to avoid conflict. Once I refused, supported by someone who actually cared, the control they had over me began to crumble. I started making decisions without fear of their judgment. I invested in my home, upgraded my career skills, and even traveled for conferences, things I had always dreamed of doing but had avoided because of the family expectations. Daniel, meanwhile, didn't take kindly to this shift. He had spent years being the golden child, and now suddenly he was living in the shadow of his younger sister, the one he had tried to sabotage. At first, he tried passive-aggressive comments. Then small digs. Finally, he resorted to subtle manipulations to try to regain some control. But by this point, I was prepared. I had boundaries, evidence of my independence, and the unwavering support of my grandma. For the first time, I felt untouchable, not in a boastful way, but in a way that was deeply freeing. I realized that success wasn't just about money or career. It was about standing up for yourself, defining your own worth, and refusing to be manipulated by those who were supposed to love you unconditionally but didn't. I had finally stepped into my own life. And it felt incredible. A few months after things had settled, my parents attempted another tactic. This time, it wasn't about money for Daniel's living expenses. No, now they tried guilt. "After everything we did for you," my mom said during a phone call, "you're just going to leave us to deal with him?" I felt my jaw tighten. "Mom, you didn't do anything for me. You compared me to Daniel my whole life. You never supported me. I worked for everything on my own." My dad's voice rose. "Ungrateful. We raised you. Everything we gave you, food, shelter, school, you should be thankful." I couldn't help it, I laughed softly, incredulous. "You call neglect and constant comparisons raising me? Really?" There was silence on the line. I could hear my mom's shallow breathing. My dad's stubborn pause. I didn't back down. I had been quiet for too long. I had finally learned that their words had no power over me anymore. And once again, my grandma intervened. She reminded them firmly. "You gave her nothing that makes her owe you gratitude. She earned everything herself. If you think you can manipulate her with guilt, think again. For the first time, I felt completely untouchable, not because of my success alone, but because I was no longer dependent on their approval. After that confrontation, my life finally felt free from constant pressure. Daniel still occasionally tried to undermine me subtly, but I had learned to protect myself. I focused on my career, my home, and the friendships I had built over the years. I realized that my parents' obsession with Daniel's success was never going to change, and that was okay. I no longer needed their approval or validation. I was standing on my own 2 feet, and for the first time, I truly felt like I belonged in my own life. I maintained a polite distance from my parents, communicating only when necessary, but I no longer allowed them to dictate my decisions. The balance of power had shifted. I had earned my space, my respect, my life. The most important lesson I learned through all of this: family doesn't always protect you, but there are people who will. My grandma had been my anchor from the beginning. She gave me the tools, the support, and the courage to fight for myself when everyone else dismissed me. Without her, I might have let the comparisons, the favoritism, and the sabotage define my life. Now, I live in my house, working a job I love, surrounded by people who respect me. Daniel's life continues to be his own mess to sort out, and I no longer carry the burden of fixing it. I finally understand that self-worth isn't given by parents, and success isn't measured by their approval. Sometimes, the people who should be your champions are the ones holding you back. And sometimes, it takes just one person who believes in you to help you rise above it all. I am no longer the backup child. I am me, and that is enough.